There have been some great decisions that have come down over the last week or so, because the Supreme Court term ended this week. From the great decisions from the Supreme Court show why it's so important to have a solid conservative majority, because many of these decisions were 5-4, where Justice Kennedy was obviously one of the votes. And one of the big decisions was the support of the upholding of President Trump's travel ban. Now recall, the travel ban was the cause célèbre for the left, where the president wanted to restrict individuals coming into the country from certain countries. And the left said, well, you know, he hates Muslims and it's anti-Muslim, and therefore he's not allowed to restrict anyone from coming in. Well, that isn't the reality of how the ban, or the travel restrictions, were implemented. It included countries that weren't Muslim. It included countries only that represented a small portion of Muslim population worldwide. So if you wanted to restrict Muslims coming into the United States, you'd have to have a travel ban, for instance, against Indonesia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and of course, travel ban didn't extend to that. It extended to countries where there were the functioning governments were virtually non-existent. They couldn't figure out who was actually coming in from the country because the government programs, the government was inoperable, it was unable to operate in places like Yemen or Libya. Iraq for a time was there, but it was taken off. So these countries were no man land in terms of not being able to provide our security personnel here that protect our border and entry points from figuring out who it is exactly is coming from those particular places. So it had nothing to do with being a Muslim. Now, to be clear, we got a real problem when we don't try to figure out if Islamic jihadists are coming into the country. And the president's very concerned about that. The political class falls down on the ground whenever you mention it. But the idea that we may have little in place to make sure that Islamic jihadists don't come into the country, who adhere to that radical ideology don't come into the country, is problematic. So anyway, so this 5-4 decision upheld the president's right to restrict individuals coming into the country, a right which he has by law. And you had all these anti-Trump judges at the lower courts deny him his right under the law and under the Constitution to decide who comes into the country and who doesn't. In cases of emergency, and generally speaking, he has the right to restrict categories of individuals from coming into the country. Chief Justice Roberts wrote quite correctly, and he referenced the law I'm talking about, by its plain language. See, this is very controversial for the left, to cite the plain language of the law. The law grants the president broad discretion to suspend the entry of aliens into the United States. The president lawfully exercised that discretion based on his findings, following a worldwide multi-agency review, that the entry of the covered aliens would be detrimental to the national interest. So he followed all the rules, but Justice Sotomayor, who was, I think, the lead author of the dissent, she was very upset because she said, well, he didn't like Muslims, so therefore he can't have this quite defensible ban on people coming from countries that are out of control. And thankfully, there were 5 justices that upheld the president's right to do this. And this is why it's important we get additional justices and solidify the majority, so the leftist craziness at the lower courts, where President Trump isn't able to be president because they don't like him. So the law that allows presidents the discretion to limit entry into the United States doesn't apply to President Trump because they don't like him personally. I mean, this is why these court fights are important, because we can't have judges who are both, by the way, Republican and Democrat appointees who believe this. So I'm glad the Supreme Court didn't buy into the politics of this and applied the rule of law.